If I could have everyone's attention. It's a very lively, chipper group this morning. I want to know whatever you had in your coffee, I want some of it. All right, well, welcome back. This is our 10:30 session, Adapting Neighbor Rosicky. And our speaker today is Jessica Chipman. For her, Jessica asks, which stories are important to surround ourselves with and to share with others? Jessica's presentation this morning will be followed by a moderated discussion with me, Rachel Olson, Director of Education and Engagement, and then an audience Q&A. So when we're ready for the audience Q&A, Nick will take the microphone across the auditorium to whoever is ready to pose their question. If you have a question that you want to write down so you remember, there are some index cards at the back table where our conference academic directors, Sarah Claire and Kelsey Squire, are seated. All right, now before I turn the microphone over to Jessica, I'm going to tell you a little bit about her. Jessica Chipman is a writer, theater artist, and educator based out of Minnesota. Her work is recognized by many educational organizations, including the Minnesota Educational Theater Association, the Minnesota State High School League, and the Iowa State Education Association. Jessica is the 2023-2024 recipient of the National Federation of High Schools Region 5 Outstanding Theater Educator Award. And I should also note that Jessica is a 2020 Educator Scholarship recipient who was unable to travel to Red Cloud that year due to the pandemic. So please help me finally welcome Jessica Chipman to the Red Cloud Opera House.
Thank you so much for that wonderful introduction, Rachel. I am delighted to finally be in Red Cloud and make my way over from Minnesota. And I had a beautiful drive yesterday and again this morning, and I'm just tickled that I finally get to be in the room talking about one of my favorite stories and one of my favorite things, which is making theater with young people. So I really appreciate the opportunity to be here with everyone today. In order to talk about adapting Neighbour Rosicky, I would love to share with you two things about myself, if that is okay, if you would indulge me just for a minute. The first is my opinion, which is shared by many theater artists, but it is that theater and its art form at its best teaches everyone involved, from the audience themselves to the artists making it, the creative teams, technicians, anyone involved with that theater making, about themselves and the world. And that in itself, in its beauty, is a communal experience. It's shared just like we're sharing an experience right here. And so that was my philosophy going into all of the theater that I work on, but it has a special place, that philosophy, when it comes to Cather's work and adapting Neighbour Rosicky. So I also would love to take you back to about 12 years ago, and I was hired to teach in an English language arts position, 11th grade, American literature in a school in southern Iowa. And in the past 6 months, I had moved twice. Thank you. Oh. Yes. Can you hear me? Okay, wonderful. Thank you. In the past 6 months, I had moved twice and gotten a new full-time job and had a baby. And so, as you might imagine, in that new position and the chaos that was in my life at the time, I was leaning very heavily on caffeine, but also leaning very heavily on my brand new coworkers to help me with the curriculum that we were both teaching. And I remember at the end of one school day, the woman who taught next door to me, Jennifer Cohorst, said, "Hey, here's what we're looking at next week with 11th graders in American literature." And it was Neighbour Rosicky, and I had never heard of it, though I had, of course, heard of Cather's work and had read some of her novels, but didn't know that short story. And she said, "This one means a lot to me." And I said, "Okay." And I found myself that night, after the baby went to sleep, late into the night, reading the short story and realizing absolutely how beautiful it was and why it meant so much to so many people, but especially to my coworker. And that is the start of my love story with Neighbour Rosicky. When I read the short story, there were a number of things, of course, that I really enjoyed and took away from it, but the first is the answering, or at least the posing of a question that to me was, how is a life well lived? Rosicky's heart, of course, and Cather's beautiful, unpretentious, in my opinion, prose, and you might agree with me on that, of course, I think, some of you in this room. I also want to share that, of course, I'm coming from a point of view here as a theater artist and a writer, and I know there are so many in this space who have so much more information about the short story alone than I do and its history, and I'm looking forward to having those conversations with you and hearing from you about your knowledge as well about Neighbour Rosicky. So a number of years ago, maybe about 4 or 5 years ago, I decided in my playwriting time that I wanted to adapt more works. And I'd been writing plays for a while, writing for my students always, and little short scenes here and there, and that grew into one-act plays, that grew into full-length plays, and now that's a major part of my work as a theater artist, is playwriting. And I thought about the short story that I could never get out of my head, and decided to contact the folks here at the Willa Cather Center, and had wonderful correspondence with Ashley and Rachel both, and wound up optioning it for a stage adaptation. And didn't know really where that would go, but my goals for the adaptation were first, of course, to stay true to Cather's story, her intention as I may have interpreted it, and then the spirit of her work. The second was to find theatricality and find that communal experience that could be had between the artists and the audience. And that included something that felt alive, something with breath and magic. To third, find and maintain the dramatic action of the short story and the characters' goals, and making sure that those characters' goals were really clear. And then fourth, to make something that could be suitable for all audiences and artists, simply because I loved the short story so much, and I wanted to ask the question, what stories need to be in our lives and why, and how can we get those out to other folks? So those were some of my goals. I wrote a draft, turned into a full-length play, and it didn't really go anywhere. As many of you know, the pandemic had a lot to do with us not being around each other, not having these communal experiences, and for those of us involved in the theater, that meant that many stages were dark for a long amount of months. And when theater did return, that meant that it was important for some theaters to make money, and so new work was not something that a lot of folks were looking at. So I set that draft aside, and then this year I was working with my one-act play students, and realized as I was reading a whole bunch of one-act plays and knowing the people that they were, that it might be time to revisit Neighbour Rosicky, and I'll be sharing a little bit about that today. Let's talk a little bit about the stage adaptation and how I found out some differences that might need to take place from the short story in order for it to be theatricalized. In my thinking, as I was reading through the short story, there were two ways that it could be adapted in its structure. And one was in more of a narrator form, with a character perhaps like Dr. Burley being the narrator. And another was to have to remove some of the characters in order to maintain the dramatic action. Start of the play, and then is not seen again. So we know that he's been to visit a doctor, but we do not know the outcome until Anton himself shares the information with Mary in a later scene. The Rosicky children, in the original, there are so many that in a stage adaptation, you have to think about how you can get a number of people on stage in a feasible way and to maintain their characters so all of those characters have agency and autonomy and individual characteristics and goals. So that was changed to 3 boys in the one-act adaptation. And then the character of Polly was someone who I thought was so, when I was interpreting the short story, it was someone who I wanted to know more about. And it was a character who I thought deserved her story to be told as well as Anton's. So I decided to follow her through line a little bit in the adaptation. And then in order to create that theatricality, which was a goal of the adaptation, I decided that 2 people would play Rosicky himself. So we had Anton Rosicky in real time in one of the through lines of the story, and then young Rosicky, who experienced what Rosicky experienced in New York City and his time as a tailor, and also in London. So I told you a little bit about my structure for the play and why I decided to take a unique approach and not use any sort of narration or anything like that. So we went with 2 interweaving storylines. I took Anton and his present and what he was dealing with, having heard about his heart condition, and then Polly, and I told their 2 stories and then interwove from Anton's past, which so informed, of course, his present and his philosophy of life, which was one of my major takeaways as a playwright. Then there's the goose. So we know that at one of the most climactic moments in Anton's past, he, in a fit of desperation and hunger, eats his landlady's goose, takes it, it's her Christmas goose, I believe, and then feels horribly about that to the point where he's devastated and forlorn. And that really fed the dramatic action of that storyline. And so there was a time in theatricality of the play where Polly herself has this goose and she doesn't know how she's going to get rid of it or why it's there. It seems as if no one else in the world can see it except for Anton. And so they share a moment of connection with this goose. And then I shared a little bit about the beginning of the one-act play and the end as well. But the beginning, we have Anton, and all the characters in his life are coming onto the stage in different vignettes. And he's looking out over his field of alfalfa, which we created. I'll show you a picture in just a second. And then all those people are there in his life, and then they come into his life at the end as well. All these characters and their relationships with him, little vignettes, his boys playing toss with a prop in the show, Polly and Rudolph and Mary, all coming in to basically send him off at the end of his life. And that was one of the focuses of the structure as I adapted it as well. As we were working on the one-act play this past January, there were some remaining elements that my students fought me on to keep in the play that I thought were really crucial because of the meaning of the work. First was Rosicky's relationship with his wife, Mary. That was really crucial. We wanted to show their love and her support of him and then his support of her as well. I mentioned going back in time in his memory to London and New York City. My students, in our one-act play contest, there's a rule that your play must be 35 minutes or fewer, otherwise you are disqualified. So, if you are familiar at all with teenagers, you know that they want to make sure that their work counts and that they are not disqualified. So they were trying to see how we could cut the play, and it was really important to maintain that storyline because that shows how his life changed and how his philosophy, Anton Rosicky's life, changed as well. And then there's the story of the corn when is it fire or deep heat or something like that destroys all the corn in the surrounding area and years ago and in the past, and his crops are lost. And they decide to go out and have a picnic in the grove, and he plays with all of his boys, I believe, as well, because there's nothing to be done about the corn. So Rosicky's point of view is why should he worry about that? Why should he dwell on that or try to save anything when it's lost anyway? He might as well have those memories that he's creating with his family. So Mary in the adaptation tells that story, which is the impetus for Polly's character to take action. We also made some discoveries as a group about the story that I think maybe I didn't interpret right away, but when you start working on something, it becomes this malleable thing when it comes to the theater. So we realized that it's likely that Rosicky's character, as an immigrant, may have been up against some biases in his time in both London and New York City. And so there were opportunities for side characters in those scenes to show their biases to his character. That wound up being really important parts of the play for my students in general. His love of opera was something that I didn't interpret right away as the playwright, but when I put my director hat on, I realized there were all these beautiful moments where we could use opera and songs as interstitial moments, either underscoring scenes or in between scenes, I should say. And so one of my students has a beautiful voice, and so we recorded her singing some music, and we were able to use that as well as a little bit of dance. And then the melding of the theatricality of storylines. I mentioned that I view this as a memory play where a character's memory, where they're going back into their memory to help influence the present, and that's influencing how they have learned, and it helps the audience as well. This is where I get to brag on people that I really care about and mean a lot to me. So these are the students that I worked with on the play. We were very proud to call it the world premiere of the stage adaptation of Neighbour Rosicky. I have to say I have 0 in production show photos because we were so engrossed in our work and on the competition that not even it's one of the rules of our contest. It is very strange. But so not even like a parent could take a photo during our contest per our rules in the Minnesota State High School League without our play getting disqualified. So thereby, I never took any photos myself either, and it's just really sad because I have all these wonderful memories of them. But I can show you this one of our team out of costume, and you can see a little bit of our set in the background. One of our students served as the set designer. She also was the stage manager, did a little dramaturgy for us, and also wound up being the co-costume designer, which is one of the great things in being an educator and working with students is if they want to do it, sometimes letting them do it means that you have to do less, and also that they can be super proud of the work that they created, and her work was extraordinary. On the right there, that is one little snap that I took during a rehearsal. That's Rosicky and Mary at their dinner table. And you can see the alfalfa field we created in the background. I would love to honor the people who spent so much time on this in its original production, so I'd like to tell you a little bit about what they had to say about the play. I think it Some people might argue that working on a story like this might be something that young people might not be interested in, and at least I found that to be the opposite. So this is Markel's words. She says, "Neighbor Rosicky means so much to me because I find the themes relevant to my life. It really makes you be aware and think about the time that you have, not only with friends and family, but with yourself as well. How do you want to live your life?" This is Gavin. "Neighbor Rosicky taught me about coping." Mine is cut off. I don't know if y'all's is. Are you able to see the full screen there? Okay, let's see. There we go. Taught me about coping with loss and making the best of hard times. High school students need those lessons for later in life. Oops. This is Leah. She played Polly. "This play is suited for high school students because it's a challenge. You have to have a certain mindset when approaching this play and shouldn't be careless. It's something deep and beautiful and should be treated as such." This is Zach. He played Rudolph. "This story represents the extraordinary beauty in ordinary life. It's about the heroics that take place in the backdrop of our lives and how they can come to the forefront when we need them to." And finally, this is Sailor, who was our designer and stage manager. "This story is proof that facing adversity is an opportunity to become the most wise and empathetic version of yourself. I think it is beautiful that despite the time she lived in, Cather embraced who she was. The words on her grave have stuck with me, and I think they are directly parallel to the meaning of the play." And Sailor must have looked up those words on her grave on her own, because it's not something that I knew until I read her comments and realized that it must be a quote from, is it Maya Antonia, that I think is on her grave. And that is the end of my presentation on adapting the play. Those are my students in costume, just one snap that I was able to find. They're doing a little warm-up, but that also exemplifies the joy that was in the room, too. So, thank you very much.
All right, Jessica, if you'll join me at the comfy chairs, we will have our moderated discussion. Well, thank you so much for sharing your experience adapting Neighbor Rosicky for a one-act play and working with your students. I thought I would start off, I have some prepared questions, and as someone who has never written a play, can you talk a little bit about translating fiction and the narrative in a short story into something like stage direction? So how do you choose what you pull from to create the directions for your performers?
I think as far as stage directions are concerned, following the dramatic action of what is happening in the events in the short story is the first thing that I look at. And then along with a lot of adaptation and certainly adapting a story like this to a one-act play, I just found myself paring things down. It was just about a lot of letting go of things that I might have found really interesting or beautiful or precious, I guess, in the work as a reader of the short story, but had to get the scalpel out a little bit, I think, when it came to some of those stage directions.
You talk about this in your presentation, that you were really drawn to Polly as a character and maybe wanted to spend a little more time with her. And I don't want to spoil the one act, but there is a quality of sort of time bending or time travel even in this one act play. So it's a very interesting departure from the original narrative. And I think it's a really fun and exciting way to think about how Cather sort of volleys back and forth and how you sort of mimic that, but in a stage production. But I wonder if you could talk about what the feeling or the impulse that made you choose to bend time so that Polly could have a brush with Anton's younger self.
I think certainly this was me as the adapter of the work or taking some license with the work, and I did that with so much love for her short story too, I should say. But I found that Polly was really interesting because she seemed trapped in a similar way to young Anton, who found himself getting all the money that he needed. He was in a successful career as a tailor and realized that that was not the life for him and found his own way out. And in the stage adaptation, Polly also does the same. And she gets out of her, it could be perceived as like a mental block or a depressive state or something like that. It's not something that is ever said in the work. It's just she's very sad in her home and her marriage, but she decides to take action herself to get out of that. And then you mentioned the time bending. It's something that happens, I think, in our memories, where it's very possible for them to get fuzzy enough that we don't know exactly how something helped us out or appeared to us if it was very, very long ago. And so in the play, Polly's character is the symbol of how young Rosicky, gets himself out of the goose situation. But in that time, she's just a stand-in for however he was helped. But it meant a lot in the interconnectedness of those two storylines and their characters, that she's the one who helps him because he's the one who helps her in the real-time situation where he comes and encourages them to go out on a date and gives them a little money, I think, too, to go out on a date.
Yes, I really like how you resolve the sort of the relationship with Rudy and Polly. I won't spoil that for everyone. I also think, I wonder, we have Chekhov's gun, maybe we need Cather's goose as some kind of resolution or tool for resolution in the narrative. Now, Polly gets a lot more airtime in your one act maybe than she does in the story. But Dr. Ed, which you mentioned in your talk, is totally absent from this production. Do you want to say anything more about why you made that choice? Because I think that might be a surprise to people that have read that story several times, that Dr. Ed is just completely gone.
Yeah, I think it could be thought that it's one of the sad casualties of cutting and paring down. But I also see that it appeared to me that Cather's intention with him was to give her reader a view of the goodness in Rosicky, and to share that from the onset, though that does not create a lot of dramatic stakes, I would say, for characters and for the audience of a play to know the ending before the end. And so instead, it was my interpretation that the audience could be similar to Dr. Burley's point of view and be the Dr. Burley, I guess, or Ed, I think, you mentioned, and discover Rosicky's philosophies for living and his love for his family in real time throughout the play, rather than hearing about it right away at the start of the play.
Let's see, what should I go to next? Oh, okay. I think one of the qualities of your adaptation, or as a result of sort of condensing the story, is that some of Anton's urban life sort of brought to the fore more than it is in the story. And because of the way that time is treated in memory, it almost seems to have equal footing to his rural life. But he still seems to idealize his rural existence over his time in the city, both in London and in New York. Do you want to talk about, if you had any objectives there with sort of portraying his urban and rural life, and maybe setting them up to be kind of side by side with each other in your production?
Certainly, I think that it actually probably stemmed more from learning about him and his character and his reasons for being on the farm. I think, Rudolph has some goals of getting out, maybe making some money and making more money. And Anton basically says, I just really like the simple farm life, the simple family farm life. And so we see a dichotomy between Anton and in his younger years and Rudolph, and we see how Anton decided and got to a place when he was in his mid-30s, I think, which certainly in that era, leaving one whole life or maybe even two whole lives and going on to make your way as a farmer in a different part of the country in your mid-30s is not a change that I think a lot of folks probably made in that time. And but he was able to make the life that he wanted and valued that simplicity. And I think that dichotomy, showing that in real time and dramatic stakes, instead of Anton's character just saying, well, one time I was like you, and now I'm not like you. It's just really important, especially in the theater as a medium, to show instead of tell. And so that was part of that as well.
You shared some really wonderful insights from your students as a result of their experience with the one-act play, and which is always, heartening to hear as educators and lovers of literature and Willa Cather. Were there other, and I think that teaching in arts and humanities is really tough right now, and it's hard to sort of convince certain audiences that that's worthwhile or that that's a really valuable pursuit. So sometimes I think it's surprising when students really connect to those texts or those experiences. Are there other ways that they surprised you during this experience that you want to share?
Yes, that's one of the wonderful things about being an educator, I think, is finding the surprise and delight from the people you're working with, especially if they're young people. Other ways in which they surprised me included their wonderful suggestions. There were so many, innumerable suggestions they had to make the play better or to cut certain parts of the larger draft. Were ways in which they surprised me. And then I think the overall surprise was their buy-in to a work that they could have considered, older and not something that they would be super interested in. And then also to the meaning of the play, which, so a little background is that we've had the good fortune at the school where I work of having the one-act play be something that is really successful, if we're defining success by how well you do at contests, and that's another discussion. But so in the 7 years prior to this year, we took the top award at the state festival in Minnesota, the One Act Play Festival. And that's out of, however many schools in the large school area. So my students had been really proud of that streak. And this year, we did not go to state. We got second in the contest to go to state with this play. And the major surprise that I had is that they said, this is exactly how it was supposed to go all along, because we would not change the play or a thing about the process. And that's kind of the meaning of the story. And so, I can get a little emotional just thinking about how beautiful that was and how wonderful my time was in working with them. And I just feel so, but that gratitude. So that I would say was one of the biggest surprises.
Thank you, Jessica, for indulging my questions this morning. Now I think we can turn it over to the audience. So if you have questions for Jessica about adapting Neighbor Rosicky, or anything that you want to bring up about teaching and theater and Cather's life at the time she wrote this, please raise your hand.
Thank you, Jessica. Wonderful. I think those of us in the audience, and all of us, have a tendency sometimes to idealize Rosicky. Maybe something like the Atticus Finch syndrome. And I think of Cather's own statement that I cease to admire and begin to remember, which implies you have to get beyond the admiring your hero. Was that ever something that was part of the process of making him less perfect? Because drama often needs some of that. So was that part of your process at all?
Yeah, it certainly was. In fact, that is showing some of his, I don't know if we can call them flaws, in the remembering of his early days. There's a scene in particular where he's very dissatisfied in his youth, even though he has, we costumed him in, a tuxedo, and he had just been to the opera, and he's probably drinking too much. We can tell that from some of the actions he's taking, and he is interacting with a young woman, and he interacts with her in a way that is just kind of obtuse and thoughtless towards her, and he is not our hero in that moment. But I think hopefully what the audience was able to take away is that those types of behaviors certainly can change, and fighting for the simple life and trying to find that simple life is something that is important, as he shared as one of his goals.
For your kids, was this a one semester project or a year-long project?
Yeah, for students, we started the one-act play season in, I think, late November, and then we rehearsed through December and most of January, and then our first competition and public performances were the last week in January. And then we continue for a couple of weeks, depending on how far we go in the contest.
Yeah, okay. My other one is, practically, how do we go about pitching your creation to every high school English teacher / drama coach in fill in the blank, Nebraska? But what was it, in your experience as a teacher, what was it easy to, once you had it created, was it easy to mount the production?
I think it would be far more easy now that it has been created once and mounted once. Anytime you're mounting a script for the stage for the first time, there are a lot of hurdles that you don't anticipate. But now that as a playwright, I've taken off the director hat, put the playwright back on, and I'm able to make some changes just that would be more helpful to other educators and directors. I think it would be a little bit easier now, certainly. I also think that one thing that a lot of drama teachers are looking for is large casts, and we wound up doubling a lot of the characters, so there'd be a lot of opportunity for that as well. As far as getting this out to other educators, well, that sounds absolutely delightful, and I guess currently it's available on a platform called New Play Exchange, or just reaching out to the playwright, I guess.
We reach out a lot to, we being Cather organization, and so I gotta think that we could put that information out widely, if that's okay. Do you have an agent or something?
No, you're talking to her. I have no agent, but yeah, I would love that correspondence. That sounds fun. I mean, if other students can benefit and have joy in the experience like my students did, I think it could be a really wonderful thing.
Thank you. Drama, of course, is about conflict. And this play doesn't, this story doesn't really have a clear villain or antagonist. You talked before about the dramatic stakes. And can you give an example of where you had to, like, up the stakes to create some conflict? To me, the only villain in the story is the world of the city. And you mentioned, you put in some things about when he goes to the city getting some, so if you could talk more about how you up the conflict necessary for drama.
Certainly. So you're absolutely correct. So the city plays a large role in Rosicky's younger life. There's also a scene with one time he's an apprentice for another tailor, and that tailor is also kind of cruel to him. The landlady also is a character, and she also is harmful to him to some degree. And then with the character of Polly, I think the conflict is in the dissatisfaction in her life and the fact that she and Rudolph, they love each other in this version, in this adaptation, and they want their lives to be together, but her dissatisfaction is and her sadness is something that he is unable to interpret or get around, and so that certainly is part of the dramatic stakes. And Anton comes in as a helper for that too as well, but it is Polly who takes the action to help herself out of that as well. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yes, I see that as well. And Pearl doesn't show up at least in my adaptation, but Polly also talks about her old life and leaving her old life and her family and missing that terribly, wanting to. Mm-hmm. Yes, and that is mentioned in her work too. She said I can go back to the store or whatever too, and so. You're right. You have to find, at least in this short story, I had to find the conflict where I could and kind of really splice out those bits of conflict.
I really like the idea that you used music in the play, because music is such a part of Cather's fiction, and there's such a sound component. And I wondered if you could tell us a little bit about that music. Is it actually, are the characters, is the term diegetic, is it actually used is the music kind of functioning as a part of the play, or is it contrasting coming from somewhere else, or the characters singing in character or dancing in character? How realistic is it, or is it more spectacle?
Yes, so the young woman who sang as part of it, I think she played Polly. I think she really would have loved to sing in the show itself, but we decided to record her. And so in the opening scene between Rosicky and Mary, where he's sharing with her what the doctor said, before that he goes to the Victrola, and it plays the opera aria that she had recorded, and that plays underneath, at least in our version. And then it was also played interstitially in between scenes, and then came back as he was dying in that scene that we kind of have all the characters from his life coming back to him as well.
Hi, Jennifer. I had just one quick question. I'm another Minnesotan, and so I know what a vibrant and competitive environment for theater there is in the state. Was this play set in the past different than the other one acts? I guess I'm saying, was it kind of a one-off, or were the other ones more contemporary? Because I would guess they would be mostly more contemporary.
Are you asking about the ones that in our school in particular?
Yeah, and actually in the whole state competition.
Mm-hmm. So I think that to answer that, overall in the state of Minnesota, we're probably seeing a trend, and perhaps in Nebraska as well, towards more contemporary plays. I think that the idea behind that is that students can relate to those types of plays more. However, in our school, it really depended for me on the students that I had and that I was working with, and I really tried to find scripts or sometimes write scripts that suited them. And I think, too, I should just probably note that that is not every drama teacher's goal, but mine always relates back to the meaning shared between, the communal meaning shared between the audience and the artists.
Jessica, do you have any models, role models of playwrights who adapt fiction, who you either recommend to us or who have influenced you?
Absolutely. Two off the top of my head. Kate Hamill is an American playwright who's doing a lot of adaptation right now of different works, as well as her own original works, but her adaptations get a lot of productions. And then Lauren Gunderson is a very well-produced American playwright who is doing her own original work, but her adaptations of, I think it's Pride and Prejudice, or like offshoots of maybe those characters in Pride and Prejudice as well, that getting a lot of attention as well.
All right, everyone. Well, thank you so much for your thoughtful questions and joining us this morning. Let's give a round of applause to Jessica Chipman. At this time, I think there's a break for lunch, and programs will resume at 1 o'clock. There will be a session here in the Opera House and then one at the Ald Public Library. I should mention, too, while I have this moment with you all, that every session on Whova, or most of the sessions, have a session feedback form, so we'd love to hear your feedback. You can go to that session on your agenda and just fill out a really brief survey. I think it's maybe 5 questions. So tell us what your experience has been so far, and we'll see you after lunch. Thank you.